Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Ask the Experts. I'm Samantha Pelham, a media relations specialist here at Ohio University, and your moderator for today's conversation. Today, I'm speaking with four of our experts: Jeff Buckley, professor of geography in the College of Arts and Sciences; Gilbert Michaud, assistant professor of practice in the Voinovich School of Leadership and Public Affairs; Michelle Marone, professor of environmental health science in the College of Health Sciences and Professions; and Jason Tremblay, Russ Professor of Mechanical Engineering and Director of the Institute for Sustainable Energy and the Environment in the Russ College of Engineering and Technology. So welcome, all of you, and thank you so much for taking time out of, I'm sure, your extremely busy schedules at the end of the semester to virtually sit down here with me and talk on a very important topic that, continues to be relevant and extremely important, not just in our community, but really all over the world. So before we get started, if you could each introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your expertise in the field and your experience, that'd be great. Jeff, if you want to go ahead, we can get started with you.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I teach in the Department of Geography, and I've also worked very closely with students in the Environmental Studies program, the Voinovich School, and I was Director of Studies for the Environmental Studies program in the Honors Tutorial College for about 10 or 11 years. And so much of my background initially focused on the environmental impacts of coal mining. But I would say, probably in the late 90s, I was really starting to work more with things like urban sustainability. And as I'll try to point out later, if we can figure out how to live more sustainably in an urban context, I think there'd be a lot of benefits to that.
Great, thank you so much.
Sure.
Gilbert, how about we go to you?
Yeah, thanks, Samantha. Happy to be here. I'm Gilbert Michaud. I'm a faculty member, as mentioned, at the Voinovich School of Leadership and Public Affairs here at OU. And we have a Master's in Public Administration program and an Environmental Studies program. So I teach in both of those programs and largely focus, on clean energy, policy, and economic and workforce development. So as we're seeing energy transitions unfold and generation shifts to things like wind and solar, what does that mean for communities in terms of taxes? What does it mean in terms of workforce and economic opportunities and things of that nature? So happy to be here.
Great, thank you. Michelle.
Hi, I am Michelle Marone, and I'm, like Samantha said, a professor of environmental health science, and we'll talk a little bit about what that is shortly. In the College of Health Sciences and Professions. Having been at the university for almost 25 years now, I have had a variety of roles and responsibilities related to environmental studies and the university sustainability plan. I was the director of environmental studies at the Voinovich School for 6 years, and I was also the chair of the first iteration of the university sustainability action plan. My research really focuses on the connection between environmental conditions and health outcomes, and specifically in the Appalachian region of the country in general and of the state in particular. And I also created and teach, and I'm currently teaching it this semester, a course called Climate Change and Public Health.
Great, thank you so much. And last but certainly not least, Jason, if you want to go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Samantha. Thank you for having me here today, and look forward to our conversations. My background in sustainability really started in graduate school, where I had a fellowship working for the Department of Energy, working on developing fuel cell technology, which then transitioned into industry with an organization, Arte International, working on carbon capture, conversion of biomass, natural gas, different hydrocarbon sources into fuels, chemicals, pieces like that. Since joining Ohio University, I've been here for around 10 years and been director of ISEE, I think, for 5 years now. And I've been leading areas in development for looking at matters that not just focus on sustainability regionally, but also nationally. And ISEE, we focus on a wide plethora of sustainability issues, including energy, water, air, manufacturing materials. So really looking at life cycle analyses, the economics of various different processes and how we can, reduce energy intensity, emissions, etc.
Great. Well, thank you all again so much. I'm so glad to have you here. I mean, viewers, you're really getting some of the best of the best when it comes to people and talking about climate change and sustainability. These four have done such phenomenal work, if you can't tell just from their brief intros. So for our viewers as well, if you do have any questions for any of these experts about reducing our carbon footprint, sustainability, climate change, whether that's personal means, how companies can be more sustainable, or how climate change impacts us as well, please drop those questions in the comment section of the live stream, or feel free to direct message your questions to the Ohio University social media channels. We will do our absolute best to get to as many questions from you today as possible, and if we don't end up getting to some of your questions, do not worry, because we will get them answered by these experts and send them to you directly. So without further ado, I say let's get the conversation started. Jeff, we'll go ahead and start with you asking the questions. Can you talk a little bit about what role cities play as we plan for a more sustainable future, both nationally and globally?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And for folks who are interested in this, there have been a number of really terrific books that have come out over the years. A couple that come to mind are The Triumph of the City by Harvard economist Edward Glaeser, and David Owen, who writes for The New Yorker, has also written primarily about New York City and Manhattan in particular. And so I'll just sort of start there. And I think there's been a perception of cities as sort of this blight on the landscape, about as anti-environment friendly as you can imagine. But in fact, the opposite is really true. Per capita urban residents, especially in well-planned cities or very densely populated cities like New York, parts of Chicago, Boston, Washington, D.C., they tend to consume a lot less energy per capita. And one of the reasons is they drive a lot less. So if you look at the average Manhattanite, that individual consumes fossil fuels at the rate that the average American did back in the 1920s. Living in apartments, if you're in a tall apartment building, you can't accumulate a lot of stuff that uses energy. All right, we're kind of squeezed for space, and you tend to use less energy than you would if you lived in a detached dwelling somewhere in suburbia. And population density also allows tax dollars to accumulate, to pile up, and then you can afford things like expanding public transit or making improvements to public transit. So as Glaeser, David Owen, and numerous other people would remind us, one of the worst things we do from an environmental perspective is spread ourselves out thinly across the landscape. So this idea that, I'm going to go back to nature, live in my cabin out in the woods, if we all do that, that creates a huge problem. So designing cities well with mixed use zoning so that residents aren't too far from shops and things like that. You shorten distances and people are able to walk and take public transit. And I think one of the key reasons that cities matter so much is that 83% of Americans live in a metropolitan statistical area. So most of us live urban. Now, there's a big difference between those who live in Manhattan and those who live in, say, Houston, where things are very spread out, or Atlanta, and most people are driving everywhere. So areas where we can really minimize the amount of driving, cars tend to be energy amplifiers, causing us to spread out and consume even more energy. So I'll stop there, but there are a lot of advantages to living more urban and trying not to cause harm beyond the urban boundaries.
Great, thank you. I mean, yeah, it makes a lot of sense when you put it that way and explain it. I know myself living in an urban area for some years, you're right. I walked everywhere. I never used a car. I had such a small apartment that there was no need to have anything that would use energy. But yeah, so thank you so much for going to that detail.
Sure.
Kind of speaking about, or jumping gears here to Gilbert, we'll talk here a little bit more about, renewable energy. Can you talk about why we are starting to see more renewable energy being built in the U.S., whether that's urban or rural areas?
Yeah, good question. So what I study basically is, trying to understand how and why and where we're deploying renewable energy, right? And I think from this climate change decarbonization perspective, this is really important. It's really transportation and electricity generation are the biggest drivers and the biggest sort of emitters when it comes to the burning of fossil fuels. And so a lot of the work, like I said, I've been doing is trying to understand what are the drivers for this energy transition? And one of the most sort of clear and obvious ones over the past few years has been declining costs, right? As technologies become more advanced and better, we have more folks that are manufacturing things like solar panels and modules and wind turbines, et cetera. The costs have declined really dramatically just in the past 5-10 years. And so it's cheaper and more efficient to deploy these types of renewable technologies. I think that as policy continues to get adopted and states and localities and utilities and many other folks become more familiar with how to best do this, we're seeing sort of this diffusion process where the state of X has done this and this worked really well, and another state is maybe going to follow suit. And so we're seeing some sort of adoption and diffusion process from that perspective. And then I think that we're just seeing an increase in demand from a lot of folks, including corporate demand, like a lot of businesses that have sustainability missions and goals and are saying, hey, we want to be 50% or we want to be 100% renewable energy, and thus we want to have things like on-site solar, or we want to purchase the outputs of renewable energy projects and that are nearby to us. And so that's been a really big driver. And I think homeowners, local governments, a lot of other folks, even beyond sort of industry and the business community, is also seeking solar and wind and other outputs like that as they're trying to be smarter and more responsible and such to the environment. And so I think costs have declined a lot. We have sort of this policy adoption diffusion thing going on, and more folks are familiar with how to deploy it and how to encourage it from a governmental and financial perspective. And then also we're seeing just an increase in familiarity and demand from a lot of folks too. So hopefully that's helpful.
Great, thank you. And then kind of transitioning off of that, you talked about how corporations and businesses may be looking in some way to be more sustainable or find renewable energy. And I know, Jason, you're actually working to help build materials that are more sustainable. So can you talk a little bit about, the ISEE that you direct and its mission and how it helps, kind of allow these materials to be built more sustainably?
Sure, and it's a good transition point. Speaking of carbon emissions, looking at whether it's power production or transportation, those are our largest emitting sources. But closely behind those are the materials that we actually utilize to build our houses, buildings, skyscrapers, etc. And so there hasn't been as much focus on that particular segment of our economy and decarbonizing it. And the big issue that we're trying to address is really embodied carbon. So embodied carbon is, this concept of, whatever material we choose to use, the carbon emissions that are associated with its, manufacturing, the materials that are used to derive those materials. And so, the primary materials that we use for building, whether it be, say, cement, metals, etc., are very energy and emissions intensive. And so we've been looking at some alternative ways that we can make replacement for these materials, but they're carbon based. So with the standpoint of, if the carbon actually remains in our product, it's not being emitted into the environment. And so we've been developing some novel chemistry methodologies, which we're coupling with mature manufacturing technologies, where we hope that we can, reduce the development curve, and so we can take these out into the marketplace sooner. And so we're partnered with some different industry partners, everywhere from small businesses up to large, $1 billion plus enterprises, and with the Department of Energy as well. And so trying to work in developing these advanced carbon materials, which we can place into different building applications.
Wow, that's incredible that we're able to do that, and that you're working towards doing that as well, that it's going to be overall so helpful to both companies and communities, but to us too. And speaking about kind of like the impacts that these changes make, Michelle, this is going to be directed towards you. Can you talk about what actually is environmental health and what environmental health professionals do? Because all of these, things that we're talking about today does have an impact on us and our health that might not always be looked at or thought about.
Yeah, believe it or not, the connection between climate change and public health, talking about that connection is relatively new. It hasn't been something that's, been examined or discussed or even researched as much as some of the other, the engineering and technology components of climate change, solving the problem of climate change. So environmental health professionals really, they take a look at environmental conditions and assess environmental conditions and try to do the best that they can to prevent environmental conditions from affecting health. And when it comes to sustainability and the impacts that climate change are likely to have, the environmental health angle allows us to bring in social and environmental justice issues. And so the communities that are some of the communities that are most vulnerable and are likely to be most affected by climate change, and that connection between climate change and sustainability are likely going to be, number one, those that contribute the least to the problem, and number two, already suffering from a multitude of environmental conditions that are affecting their health. And so the connection between sustainability as an environmental and social justice issue and climate change and public health is really an important component and in the realm of environmental health professionals. Not only that, but many environmental health professionals will end up working in local health departments. And the local health departments are the ones that are going to bear a huge burden of helping their communities cope with, extreme weather events or, any of the other potential climate change issues. And the local health departments are very under-resourced, and the environmental health profession is a big part of the local response to any of the climate change impacts. So that's kind of a rambling answer, but I think number one, it's relatively recently that we've been researching and talking about the connection between sustainability, climate change, and public health. And because of our current conditions, everybody is hearing the words public health every day. So here, I appreciate the opportunity to bring it into this conversation today.
Yeah, of course. And thank you for doing that, because, it is important. And especially, with everything going on today, I think it is a conversation that needs to be had. And I'm glad we can do so on this platform. So we've actually received our first question from social media for you all. So this is directed for all four of you. So I will give you each the opportunity to speak, but feel free, whoever wants to jump in first, to answer. So the question is, I'm wondering if any of the experts have reviewed President Biden's American Jobs Plan and could speak to some of the ways in which elements of that plan will help to combat the climate crisis. Does it go far enough in your opinion? And if not, what would you add or change? And please let me know if you want me to repeat any parts of that either.
I can jump in first real quick.
I have not reviewed the American Jobs Plan. Go ahead, Gilbert.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I've looked at it a little bit, but admittedly not enough to maybe adequately answer this question. But a lot of the work that I do does focus on sort of economic and workforce development related to things like clean energy deployment, right? And I think if we're investing in grid modernization and infrastructure and ways that we can nudge new technologies such as renewable energy, that's largely what I study, right? Which is what are the ancillary impacts of that, especially from an economic perspective. And when we think about something like looking at job impacts, it's really important to be good consumers of those data and understand that what it means is that we have folks directly that are building a solar farm or building a wind farm or working in the manufacturing piece of that. And then we have all these ancillary impacts where we have folks that are also being supported from a jobs perspective that are transporting materials to the site. Maybe there are other sort of strategic partners like legal or accounting or other things like that. And then all of these folks are spending money in their state or in the regional economy, and they're helping support folks that work at grocery stores and restaurants, and it's sort of this multiplier effect, right? And so when you see something about, hey, we're going to invest X amount of $1 billion in this or what have you, and trying to look at what those job totals mean. And I'm maybe not answering the question directly, but I just wanted to make the point clear that those big job totals are actually a function of how this breaks down at a more granular level, right? I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in.
I can comment a little on the infrastructure and what I have not read the jobs plan, but I think I have an understanding of the mission for some of the infrastructure improvements. And we are so far behind in basic environmental health infrastructure. And a really good example of that is sewers. We have a very poor sewer system, especially in cities, Jeff. The sewer systems are really outdated. And so what does that mean for, sustainability? Well, our sewers can't handle extreme weather events, right? So we see an event like Hurricane Sandy in the city of New York just overwhelm the sewer system and, close down not just the sewers and the water treatment plants, but the transportation infrastructure is shut down. So anything that we can do to improve just basic sanitation infrastructure is going to indirectly and directly help us deal with any climate change impacts.
If I could just build on what Michelle was saying there, and also Gilbert, just speaking about outdated sewer systems. A lot of these were constructed in the 19th century, places like Chicago, New York, places that have combined sewer systems. So they are taking sewage waste, but they're also taking runoff from precipitation. Those systems get overwhelmed a lot. And so you get flows of sort of diluted sewage into surface waters, and those can obviously cause some health problems. One of the big problems that we face in urban America today is that in some of our cities, if you look at the top 10 most populous cities in 1950 and compare them to today, there are only two cities that have actually grown in population, and that's New York and Los Angeles. And Los Angeles primarily by gobbling up surrounding areas and then renaming them Los Angeles. A lot of those cities have lost population. So Baltimore has a sewer system that was supposed to accommodate 1 million people, and they've lost hundreds of thousands of residents since then. And there's no way we're going to be rebuilding a sewer system. Those big engineered fixes are probably not going to be seen again in cities like Baltimore. So figuring out greener ways to prevent surface waters from going into the sewer system in the first place are key. And then just echoing the points that Gilbert was making too. I think one of the keys going forward. And again, I have not read the bill, but by having a massive investment like this, I think it will also give investors confidence that this is here to stay. Because I think one of the problems, you see this in Ohio, there's been a lot of back and forth, like, oh, we're going to do solar, now we're not going to do solar. And if you're thinking of investing money, it's more of a risk. But if you can really see this as something that's here to stay, it's going to be part of our future, then that lowers that risk. And so I think that would ease a transition to renewable fuels.
Anything that is done and anything that's funded, though, it cannot be. One of the things that needs to happen is any of these investments have to be based on future planning. It can't be, we need to just solve the problem that we have with the population today and with the current climate conditions. We also have to look at projections and really make sure that the infrastructure investments and the job training investments and all the investments we're working today are going to be, at least including some of the projections that climate change scientists are making right now.
And similar to a couple of comments, I haven't read the bill either, other than just some news articles. But looking where our infrastructure was at one point, we did have the best or nearly the best infrastructure in the world, which is a huge advantage to our economies, creating jobs and supporting all of those activities. And so, investments, and to the point in making those investments properly for the future can, go a long way in placing, the ability to create new jobs and support new jobs and placing in a advantageous economy would be significant.
Great. Thank you all so much. I mean, that is the type of conversation we need to have, and I'm glad that you all were able to put your input on that. Let's see. We have another question from social media for you all. Let's see. Athens, Ohio has an opt-in electric aggregation carbon fee through SOPEC to support renewable energy projects for municipal government buildings. Do you see initiatives like this carbon fee elsewhere, or do you think these programs will spread?
I can go first again if folks would like. I've actually written an academic paper on this and helped sort of design that program to some extent.
Yes, please.
Yeah, it's really interesting and innovative, right? It's not a full carbon free, to be clear. It's sort of a partial carbon free fee, and says, hey, we know that we're emitting harmful carbon into the atmosphere. If we sort of partially cover that, we can use those dollars to deploy local solar, right? So they've been collecting this, the cost of a cup of coffee per month kind of fee, $1.50, a pretty reasonable amount, and pulling those dollars together and saying, hey, let's do things like deploy renewables right in the city of Athens. And prior to that, and this is a little complicated, but SOPEC and other similar types of entities were meeting those sort of renewable energy desires through REC markets, renewable energy credits. So they were basically purchasing the credits from wind farms in Texas and Iowa, et cetera. So this is a really kind of cool, innovative, local democratic involvement kind of way to actually build renewable energy at the local level. And that's what's really cool about it. And I think the carbon fee has a lot of sort of promise for other communities that are similarly sized or that have community choice aggregation, which we do in Ohio, which is kind of a prerequisite to that. But to think about, again, this diffusion process, and this is a cool local innovative program. Can we deploy it in Illinois or other states that have CCA legislation? So I'll stop there, but that's just a couple of background details on it. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting program.
Thank you. Yeah, does anyone else have anything to add to that?
I would just say, oftentimes I'll hear from students, why isn't the federal government doing this or that? And I point out to them that this is sort of a typical pattern. If you look at forest conservation in the U.S., we created the first national forest in 1891, but the states were out front. There were states that were doing forest conservation before the federal government got involved. You look at surface coal mining regulation. We passed a federal law in 1977. Ohio passed a law in 1972 that really the federal legislation was kind of modeled on, and then there were sort of previous iterations. So I see this as something hopeful that you get this level of creativity at the state, local, and municipal level. And sometimes that works better than imposing something from the top down, at least at first.
Wasn't part of the question should we expand it to other places, or if it's working in Athens? Can you? Yeah. So I guess my knee-jerk reaction is if it's working in Athens, it's not likely to work in other places in the state of Ohio. And because when in Athens, I think people hear fee and they think fee, but if you say fee in some other places in Ohio, they're going to hear tax, right? They're not going to hear fee. So there's a lot of work that we need to do as educators to help with public perception of these types of solutions.
Thank you. Yeah, Jason or anyone else, do you have a comment or think that's pretty good?
I just say real quick that they actually, when they were rolling this out, had sort of initially pitched it as a carbon tax and realized that that language was maybe problematic and sort of changed it to a carbon fee, but still had to do a lot of these educational programs. And they had, Mayor Patterson out in the community and had some folks that were doing some local workshops and talking about what this looks like, et cetera. So I think that was helpful. But to your point, Michelle, I think, there's more work to be done.
Great. Thank you guys for answering that one. The next question is kind of more directed towards Jeff and Michelle, but in two different parts. So how has this global pandemic affected our environmental and sustainability efforts? Jeff, kind of in more of the essence of your expertise, and then Michelle kind of focusing more on climate change and public health, but specifically, because of COVID.
Yeah, so I think Michelle's probably the expert on this, but I'll just throw a couple things out there, and that's, just from the urban perspective, we know people aren't taking public transit as much, and for subway systems like in Washington D.C. that really depend on that income, that makes things difficult, right? If people are feeling safer being the only driver in their car, that's probably not good from a sustainability perspective. We're also seeing that people who could afford to leave the city did, even temporarily. People buying second homes, including in southeastern Ohio. There's some interesting data on that. And I think I mentioned earlier, I think we have to sort of resist the impulse to all want to sort of live in our own little place off in the country, because if we all do that, that really slices up the environment, introduces vectors for invasive species. Then you have to hook up water, sewer, all sorts of things like that. So that's not the direction we want to go. But there are some things I think we would want to hold on to. I think they're benefits that we've seen in terms of some reduced emissions, some ecological recovery as well. But I think that this is where Michelle is more the expert. We need to make sure people feel safe in urban areas when it comes to crowd diseases and things like that.
Yeah, so I actually have a lot to say about this, but I'll try to keep it narrow. So there's a couple of positive things I think that have happened because of the pandemic related to sustainability, climate change, and health. Number one is, like I said earlier, public health is in the news every day. So we've got people that are starting to understand what public health is and what we have to do to make sure that we can keep people healthy. This is going to sound weird that it's a good thing, but I actually think the fact that we're seeing disproportionate impacts of the pandemic on some populations, especially people of color, are bringing public health vulnerabilities to the forefront in a way that never would have happened had we not had the pandemic. So I think people are becoming more sensitized to how vulnerable some of our populations are. On the bad side, I think that this pandemic has really shown us our weaknesses in public health preparedness, that we didn't have a plan for this. And we've just been kind of making stuff up as we go along. And in order for us to address issues of climate change, we have to be prepared, and we're not getting prepared. And the last thing, on the kind of a negative thing, is even the local places that have been taking steps to get prepared this past 18 months, every resource at every local health department has been pulled to fighting the pandemic. So that means your environmental health professionals that do restaurant inspections and sewer inspections and things like that, they're helping man vaccine clinics. So there's been a pause, and I hope that doesn't mean we've lost momentum.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you both. Yeah, that sheds a really good light because, like I said before, I don't know if enough people think about climate change and all the impacts that it really has on our own health and in public health. So thank you both for kind of talking about the impact that this last year has had.
I'd like to add one more thing in that area. So looking at the impact of COVID, say on the energy, landscape in different market segments, as pointed out, emissions have dropped from, segments such as transportation because, many people are working from home, but because people are, they're not going on vacations, they're not traveling, they have money saved up. I don't know if anybody's tried to go to like Lowe's or Home Depot or has a home project that they're trying to move forward, but building materials and home improvement, market segment has gone gangbusters over the past year. And there's no numbers on this, but it would be interesting to see how emissions from our manufacturing sector increased over this time, while it shrunk in other areas, it potentially increased in others, and also potentially how those costs, also impact, consumer choices in terms of the materials that they're, utilizing in their construction and materials as well.
Yeah, thank you. And sorry, did someone have someone else to say?
Well, it's kind of out of sequence here, but something just occurred to me related to the vulnerable populations. And I think because of COVID, we saw, I think it was last week, the head of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention make a public statement that racism is a public health issue. And the city of Columbus and many other cities around the country had already made that statement. But I think that the pandemic, like I said, has really heightened people's awareness of this. And if racism, if governments and local, state, federal governments consider racism as a public health issue, then that is a game changer in terms of how we plan to mitigate and adapt to potential climate change issues.
Can you expand a little bit more on that, actually? I think that's really interesting, and it's something I've never personally thought about before.
Which part? That racism as a public health issue?
Well, yeah,
the adaptation and mitigation?
Yeah, what you just said, because it is, it is a public health issue, but can you expand on the mitigation of it when it comes to the ways we plan for climate change?
Well, I said mitigation, but I think from the mitigation part, I think is what Jason and Gilbert work on. How do we control emissions? What technologies can we use? The public health side of it is really going to have to focus and is focusing on the adaptation part. And how do we get people ready and prepared to cope with some of the potential impacts? And, that could be, things like better warning systems, or it could be air conditioning, to handle heat waves and things like that. But the other side of addressing the issue is really the mitigation. And that's the sustainability part of climate change, right? How do we limit emissions? And then in the umbrella of racism as a public health issue, then it's targeting adaptation techniques to communities that are most vulnerable, most underserved, and already suffer from health inequities, and making sure that decisions that we're making address those vulnerable communities.
I'll just jump in real quick and say,
yes, please.
That's okay. Yeah. That the health pandemic has obviously been a really detrimental, sad, negative thing, right? But in a more optimistic way, it's also raised a lot of important questions. I've studied sort of policy adoption and agendas and these things over time, and things shift, right? And this is a very clear example of what folks call a focusing event. And I think it's sort of snowballed into other things that are really important and interesting, right? We're now asking questions about public health. We're asking questions about equity and justice issues as it relates to climate and energy transitions, et cetera. And so we don't have all the solutions quite yet, but in a more positive way, I think that it stimulated a lot of really important questions that we probably should have been asking years ago. And now we're starting to roadmap and develop paths forward for, environment and climate and energy related equity issues or things related to public health. And this kind of ties everything together really nicely, right? And that's just my perspective.
No, thank you. I think this is a very important conversation to have. right now, amid everything that's going on between the pandemic and the fact that I feel like, policies are now just starting to change when it comes to many of these things, as well as, the fight for justice and equity for people. And Jeff, if you can actually talk a little bit on why we must factor justice and equity into the sustainability decisions we make, I think that would be a really great way to add on to this conversation.
Yeah, well, I think Michelle and Gilbert opened the door on that one for sure. But too often amenities. When we think of amenities, you might think of parks, street trees, things like that, and disamenities. Are you living next to a landfill, incinerator, polluting industry, whatever? Highway interchanges in terms of air pollution. They're unevenly distributed, and lower income, people of color, BIPOC communities tend to experience greater exposure. And as both Michelle and Gilbert pointed out, COVID has been, Gilbert called it a folksing event. It's exposed these vulnerabilities. So on the positive side, it's brought attention to them. But there have been lots of events in the past that should have brought attention to these things. Katrina, all sorts of things that have taken place actually in the distant past, preceding when this field of environmental justice really emerged in the 80s. So I just hope it's something that we don't move on from. We have a tendency really to forget these kinds of things. But after a while, I guess I would say people who live in these communities start to become suspicious of sustainability efforts. And just a quick example, Baltimore is a city that there's a very uneven distribution of tree canopy there. So there was a pretty well-funded effort to expand tree canopy into parts of East Baltimore, which were 95, 97% African American in these two neighborhoods. A lot of people, residents who were interviewed, recognized the benefits of street trees and the threat of climate change. But rather than see a tree as something positive, a lot of residents saw it as a negative, because they also recognized that when you plant a tree in front of a house, it raises the value of that house. And they saw this as the first step in gentrification and moving them out. And this is something that actually happened in Baltimore with a planned community that Johns Hopkins University had established. So, that's not something a lot of the planners were thinking. But when you put yourself in the place of a renter living in these communities, that tree can symbolize something else. So what may seem like an obvious benefit to some people isn't necessarily to others. So I think it's critical to enlist everybody's support and sustainability efforts, but you have to meet basic needs. And I think this crisis and previous crises, water crisis in Flint, for example, people are struggling for clean air, clean water, job security. And so sometimes planting street trees doesn't quite rise to that level. So we have to meet people's basic needs, to really enlist their support for things that may come across to them as a little bit more abstract.
Great, thank you. And Jason, this is kind of directed towards you, since I know that ISE has a strong focus on increasing water sustainability, kind of going off of what Jeff had just said about, water treatment and the sustainability in water. Can you describe, the efforts that the ISE are doing and why it's important for water sustainability?
Yeah, absolutely. So over the past probably 7 years or so, we've really increased our research in water sustainability, really focusing on two different areas. The first being produced water management, so the really heavy, briny liquids that are generated in oil and gas operations. And so those, potentially pose a management issue in terms of them, traveling on our roads, questions around injection and long-term integrity, potentially groundwater contamination, and also just from the oil and gas operations, they utilize a lot of water in terms of their operations, and so we've been developing some technologies there that help us take that water, but not necessarily to say, discharge that water, but treat it in such a manner that it can be reused within that industry so that it isn't, it reduces the amount that they're taking out from, surface water or reservoirs, et cetera. And the other area that we've been working on is really from a eutrophication, basically, contamination of our surface and groundwater from nutrient pollution, say, mainly looking at farming, et cetera, but it raises a lot of issues in terms of, climate change, sustainability. We've seen issues in North Carolina where we have these large farms with large animal waste pits. Hurricane comes through, floods those. Now you have this material that's out there contaminating surface and drinking water sources. And so the other area, we've been working with the state to develop an electrochemical-based methodology that we can, recover, say phosphorus and nitrogen in a reusable fertilizer that can be reused with the industry. But then even more recently, we have a new grant where we're looking at taking that type of technology and placing it into municipal wastewater treatment facilities. Also with the fact of, trying to recover nutrients, but also reduce, energy consumption costs from wastewater treatment facilities as well.
I think we lost Samantha.
I think so too.
That's not good. All right, I'm going to make the executive decision. Michelle, you are now the
Moderator.
Gilbert, what are you working on right now that's related to the topic that we're talking about today?
Yeah, well, it's been over the past 2-3 years actually, where really large, utility scale solar projects have been emerging across Ohio. A lot of developers are seeking to build projects, especially in the western part of the state where it's flat, it's relatively sunny. There's good interconnection points to the grid and substations that can handle that voltage, et cetera. And so a lot of the work that I've been doing is trying to understand the regulatory and approval processes for these types of projects, trying to understand the things that I study, right, in terms of the economic and workforce and environmental impacts and implications of those types of projects. And we just got a new grant from the U.S. Department of Energy to study this from a comparative perspective, which I'm really excited about, learning about how our process sort of works in Ohio and why developers are interested in building solar here, and then sort of what it looks like in other Midwestern states, local control versus state and centralized approval or control, or other types of really important issues that relate to things like land use trade-offs, right? Are we having this discussion of food versus energy security? Are we taking all this ag land out of production? What does it mean for soil and water and wildlife and all of these types of things that are really important, right? So we're just sort of dipping our toes into those waters about some of those newer questions, but I think that they're going to continue to accelerate and emerge over the next few years and are really important, frankly. Sorry, Samantha, I think we lost you for a bit.
No, you're okay. I'm glad you guys kept the conversation going. I'm just sad I missed it a bit. I'll have to go back and watch it. Sorry, go on, Michelle.
Well, I was just going to follow up with Gilbert to see, you said you're working in Northwest Ohio. Are you anticipating or have you seen any pushback from people who live up there to solar energy?
Yeah, definitely. It was sort of in its infancy a few years ago, and folks were sort of, you didn't hear a lot of buzz, or folks were sort of learning more about renewables and things like solar farms, and now there's a lot of opposition groups that have emerged, and this is kind of your traditional NIMBYs, right? But there's a lot of other folks that are asking questions about, what does this mean for local taxes in our schools? What does this mean for my family farm that's been in my family for 6 generations? There's a lot of interesting questions, and there's actually a couple of, there's a Senate and House bill Senate Bill 52 and House Bill 118 that are trying to institute sort of this local referendum to this process. Everything sort of happens from a decision-making and approval process in Columbus. And now they're sort of saying, hey, maybe we should put this to a local vote and see if the locals want this kind of project in their community. So I don't know if it'll go forward or not, and I won't comment on whether it's good or not necessarily, but I think it's really interesting.
If you
go ahead, Jeff.
I was just going to say, if you go to the Energy Information Agency webpage, there's a terrific map of wind power and, by state. And it's really incredible when you look at what's happening in Iowa and Kansas. I think now for both of those states, more than 40% of their electricity comes from wind. And Iowa's a state that has coal deposits, but I think at some point, they chose to leave those in the ground rather than surface mine because of the value probably of the agricultural land. And so there clearly are models out there. I don't think it's because people have a greater environmental conscience there, but it's profitable. And so I think those are some positive signs. And there's several states now in the past 5-10 years out there that are really expanding that infrastructure.
And I think, I don't know how you all feel, but I feel like I'm coming out of a bunker where I've been in hiding as a scientist for like 4 years. And now we have this opportunity and we've got people's attention because of the pandemic, that we have to seize the opportunity to do whatever we can to raise awareness, educate people and, talk about the importance of science and making decisions. So.
We have another question from social media for you all. The question is, what is the outlook of community solar initiatives in Ohio, and what barriers exist policy-wise that prevents these projects from happening?
I feel like this is directed
I was
at
going
me.
to say this might be towards you.
This is what I wrote my dissertation on. So community solar is a really promising kind of model, right, where it allows renters and folks that live with HOAs or lower income folks, et cetera, shading, permitting issues to invest in sort of off-site shared solar projects, right? And that's a really promising way to make sure that we're hitting on these equity issues and we're allowing sort of more folks to participate, access, and equity, right? And there's ways that we can do this through sort of rural electric co-ops or through innovative programs like SOPEC is doing, sort of quasi-community solar. But really the best way to do this is to have that enabling legislation that allows you to remotely net meter into an off-site system. And Ohio doesn't currently have that. I think it's about 21 states that do. And so it's going to be interesting to see if Ohio at some point adopts something like community net metering or community solar legislation. But for now, we're sort of going through this process where we're trying to develop sort of loophole programs at the local level that can work around those policy barriers and still achieve some of the same objectives. And back to Jeff's point a while ago, that's a really important piece of sort of policy adoption, right? We usually don't go from 0 to 100. We didn't have something and then we passed the bill and now we can do this kind of project. We usually go through this learning and diffusion process of, hey, look at what SOPEC's doing. And hey, look at what this co-op is doing. And then folks start to learn more and become educated. And then the policymakers sort of start paying attention too and say, hey, if we do this, we can help, mitigate carbon emissions, or we can help support local jobs in this industry, et cetera. And so that's sort of been the process and playbook, if you will, for a lot of other states. So I remain not optimistic that Ohio at some point we can do sort of true community solar and pass that kind of policy. But at this point, we're sort of still going through the growing pains.
And then we have one last question. Unfortunately, we're getting to our hour to wrap this up. But another question on social media is, how is we have individuals with no expertise in this, how can we adapt our lives to being more sustainable? And what advice would you give for those who are looking to help stop climate change?
Well, I mean, I'll start. There are so many decisions we make on a daily basis. I mean, it can be overwhelming, when you're shopping and you're thinking, oh, yes, I'm trying to buy things that don't have high fructose corn syrup or contribute to the energy intensive way we're producing food. And obviously there's some things that are beyond our control, but we can all make decisions about how we travel and the the sort of the day-to-day lifestyle decisions we make. I mean, those are all within our power, again, we don't have to necessarily be held hostage by government policies on this and that. There's so many benefits to deciding, what, I'm just going to walk to work. I don't need to drive. In my case, I live 1.5 miles from work. But it's rain or shine. Yeah, you just walk or you bike. It's really it's not that hard. So you can make these lifestyle changes, and I think that's one thing that I saw a study that's coming out of Oslo, where people are looking at changing exercise patterns, and people are getting out, not driving, and there are real health benefits from that. So I think we need to just think carefully about the technologies we adopt. Some are great, and others, maybe we can take a pass on. So I would just say we have a lot of autonomy that we can exercise as consumers.
And I want to say one of the things that I've been very excited and heartened about and it's kind of in a weird way again, but this past year or so is the willingness of young people to engage and to pick up a sign and march in the streets. And that gives me a lot of hope. In addition to making some lifestyle changes, getting engaged. And if you don't want to pick up a sign and walk in the street, then make sure that your elected officials know how you feel and that type of engagement. So being politically active on any social justice issue right now is going to have ripple effects for sustainability and climate change. I really believe that.
I was going to say the same sort of thing. I'm a big sort of civic engagement guy, and I always bring my students out to public meetings and let's go to a hearing and provide testimony if you'd like, or let's go to the Environment and Sustainability Commission meeting in the city of Athens. Getting involved is really important. So I would preach that, and also take our classes. We teach this stuff. So just a selfish plug.
And I would also say, communicating your wants and needs, in terms of consumer choice, the companies that are manufacturing, the items that we're utilizing, they're responding to consumer choices and wants. So, reducing, packaging, going to more reusable packaging, those pieces. So, being in communication and voicing your opinion, writing those companies, can have a big impact as well.
Well, thank you all so incredibly much for sitting down and having this conversation. I know I learned a lot and feel like I took away a good amount of information and feel like I need to get my butt out more calling officials and into the streets and practicing sustainability better. But I really hope our viewers also got all of that out of this as well. So again, thank you from the bottom of my heart for that. And for our viewers, if you have a question about anything that these experts talked about or sustainability, please feel free to message us. We will get those questions directly to these experts and give you an answer. Again, thank you all so much and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.